Hey there, got something a little different for you today. This is a Volvo V60. So what are we doing? We're going to do a little lift kit, larger tires to give this thing a little more ground clearance. Let's take a tape measure and see what kind of measurements we have right now for ground clearance and wheel well height. On our rear tires here, it looks like from the ground to the bottom of the wheel well, we are at 28 5/8. And on the front of the car, from the ground to the bottom of the wheel well, we are at 28 1/4 inch. Rocker ground clearance at the front looks to be right around 8 inches. And rocker ground clearance at the back looks closer to 9 inches. Our front bumper is right around 9.5 inches from the ground. Right, now it's time to get this into the garage and get our cross-country performance lift kit installed, along with our larger 245/65 R17 Scorpion Pirelli all-terrain tires. Let's go over all what we're going to be upgrading and changing on this car. So first of all, the whole point of this is to be able to get a bigger tire on this car, this lift, and the wheel spacers. So currently this car runs a 235/50 R18, and we're going to be going over to a 245/65 R17. And these tire height difference is over 2 inches taller with this new tire. The other big advantage is that this is an actual all-terrain tire versus a car tire. Obviously a lot less aggressive tread pattern, but the big thing for me is the sidewall performance. So if we want to air down these tires for off-roading, this is going to be punctured much easier than this tire is going to be. So another thing to consider when going to the larger tire is actually the tire width. These are only going to be about a 1/2 inch wider than the OEM tires. We need some extra clearance by bumping these tires out. Also, just aesthetically, it's going to look better to have that tire a little more offset, so we're going to add these 1 1/4 inch wheel spacers. As you can see, if you look down the edge of the car, we're going to bring that tire out slightly. It's going to have a real aggressive look to it. Something to note if you're not used to working on these Volvos, as you can see, this is our actual lug nut. This is a chrome cover you need to pull before pulling this. This should be 19 millimeters. Here are the components of our cross-country performance lift kit. What are we looking at here? This is your rear spring spacer. This is your front strut spacer. This is your rear shock spacer and your subframe spacers. Volvos are what's called hub-centric, so this tire is not held on by studs like some other vehicles. So when you pull this last lug nut off, this tire is going to drop, so be ready for that. All right, I'm going to start with the front of the car, which is going to be our strut spacer that goes up top. So to get this strut out of here, first thing you need to do is just pull the brake line bushing out of there, the ABS bushing out of this fitting. Then we're going to take this sway bar end link off, remove the lower bolt out of the strut, and then lower the car and take the top 3 nuts off. This is a 15 millimeter. Give that a spin so I can get into this lower bolt right here, which looks like that's also a 15 millimeter. The nut should be held captive. To get to the top of that strut, you need to go underneath the hood. And on these cars, the bolts are actually underneath this honeycomb. And fortunately for us, there's 1, 2, and they were nice enough to hide one underneath here for us. We'll have to get with a wrench rather than the impact. I'm going to start with our hidden, harder to reach bolt by actually going up underneath here with my ratcheting box wrench. So on the Overland Performance instructions, it tells you to essentially unbolt the top of this strut and drop it down enough to slip this in. Well, what I can tell you is this is a 6-inch hole up here. This does not go in there for number one. This does not drop down 6 inches, it drops down maybe 1 inch. So slipping this up in on top is not going to be an option. So what does that mean? That basically means everything here needs to come apart. I initially tried to take this bolt out, the top bolts, lower this down as much as I could with a pry bar and get this to separate out. Well, this has to raise up about 3 inches, and you only have enough room to come up about 1.5 to 2 inches. So what do you need to do? Literally everything has to come apart. So this bolt comes out, your ball joint comes apart, your steering comes off, your ABS sensor off, your sway bar link off, your brakes off. Basically, so you have this knuckle totally loose. You're going to take this off so you can pull your half shaft out of the knuckle as well. Essentially, you need the knuckle completely loose so it can come out this way and get pulled down, separated from this. Then you're going to rehang, after putting the spacer in, the strut, put your bolts in the top, the 3 bolts, loosely, and then go ahead and reinstall this knuckle with the CV going in, putting it back on the ball joint. That takes a pry bar pushing down on the control arm to get enough space, reinstall your steering, your brakes, and everything else. So a little more involved than they amount to make it sound. It'd be nice if they actually told you that all this stuff has to get pulled apart. So, lesson learned. I'm going to get into it and get this all pulled apart. Our lower ball joint seems pretty standard. It looks like just this one bolt going through. It appears to be a 15 millimeter, and the nut should be held captive. So just sliding this out, getting this to separate here at the pinch, and should be able to separate these two things. Half shaft, that's a 13 millimeter. Push this through. So at this point I have the 3 bolts still on the top of the strut. I had to reinstall those. I've removed this back bolt here. I've removed the steering, the ABS, sway bar link, brakes, and the lower bolt for the ball joint. Now I need to try to get these two separated. This was a fight yesterday. Basically used 2 3-foot breaker bars to try to get those to separate. So I'm going to try to fight those apart now. So I found that turning the wheel towards the driver's side for the driver's side, and then I was smacking a hammer here, was getting these to separate. Now I've wedged a pry bar in back there, and I'm going to put another bar on top of it to get these to separate. I'm able to get them to separate, but it's just not coming down enough, so I need a little more leverage. We are separated. Try to push this half shaft out next. Alright, everything's apart. Next thing we need to do is to get this knuckle to separate from the strut. So I'm just going to put a screwdriver in here to help separate this open, and then just should be able to wiggle this off. I've also sprayed lube inside of here to get her moving. Trying to support this, hold on to it. There she goes. Got it. She's heavy. Alright, so I lowered the car back down and I had reinstalled these two bolts, not the hard one. So once I drop these out, this strut is going to want to drop down. So the last bolt I'm going to take out, I'm going to try to reach around the wheel well and hold on to it while I take that bolt out. Here is our strut out of the car. And you can see the top of that strut has like a side that's a little more flat than the others. So this is pretty simple. You're just going to line that up with that flat side. These 3 holes are where your new bolts are going to go through. Looks like they supply you with a bag of longer bolts that are going to go up in there. There's 6 of these. So it's time to reinstall. This might be a little bit of a balance act to try to keep this together. I do wish a lot of the other strut spacers actually have a stud that bolts this in place, so it's easy to put in place. It's going to be a balancing act getting that together. From here, you're going to reinstall that strut, and I'm going to tell you 100% that is a 2-person job to put that all in place. Also a 2-person job to try to get this lower control arm down far enough to be able to get this CV and ball joint back installed. I tried to do it on my own, ended up slipping and falling, and so yeah, definitely ask somebody to come give you some help. Okay, so it's on to the subframe spacers up front here, and I had a hard time finding the front. Looks like it's underneath this wheel well cover, so I'm going to pull that out. Looks like 2 10mm and a T25 here to pull. I will say that for this, I would do this before doing the front lift in the future. You'll see that the front bolts are a little bit difficult to get to. Let's peek up in there. And it looks like that's the other subframe bolt there. It is still kind of buried. Looks like I'm going to have to put a box wrench on that, maybe a 21mm from the looks of it. To be able to even get a box wrench on there, I had to bend this out here to give myself a little bit of room to be able to turn and bend this bracket. This was pretty straight before, just so I could actually have room to be able to turn. I was able to snake the box end onto here, and I actually had to put a 2-foot breaker, just a piece of pipe, onto that to get that to start moving. After 2 or 3 flats, now it's moving just with a box wrench now. So, yeah, not easy, but I guess we're moving forward. This whole job kind of sucks. I'm more of a Jeep guy when it comes to doing lifts, and I'm learning real quick that I'm not a Volvo guy. Okay, now that I have the front subframe bolts about a 1/2 inch loose, you can see that gap there between the body and the subframe, and this is just finger tight. It's time to move our way to the back bolts to create a little more gap here to slip our spacers in. Back here, we are going to remove this 13mm, this 13mm, and then just loosen this 21 for now. Now that the front cross member, front bolts are loose and rear bolts are loose, we're going to go ahead and take our slotted spacer and slip that in here. Then we're going to go ahead and retighten these bolts with a box wrench, and we're going to work our way to the back installing those bushings. I had a little helper come to visit. Okay, so now we've already removed these 2 bolts and loosened this. We're going to finish pulling this, slip in our spacer, and these spacers are going to be the non-slotted. Again, we're working on the front cradle and the rear bolts. This is where you're going to use that supplied 4 bolts. Those are going to go in these back holes here. This is the stock bolt on the right and our new bolt on the left. And again, we've installed a spacer here. Here we are with the rear spacers installed in the front cradle, rear bolts. Okay, we're going to move on to the rear. We're going to start with the subframe spacers, and these should be pretty straightforward. On the rear, we have one mount here, another one here. Both of them look like they're a 15mm head, and so you're going to have 2 on the driver's side, 2 on the passenger side. We're going to loosen all 4 of those and replace one of these at a time, just sliding our new puck in. Okay, now that all 4 of our spacers are in on our rear subframe, we're going to go ahead and do our shock spacers. There are 2 10mm bolts on the top of the shock, so we're just going to take those off here. Pretty simple. And then we're going to slip in our new spacers and use the supplied longer bolts to reinstall that. I'm going to push down on the shock to get it out of the way. Set our spacer on top, put that down. Try to get these started in by hand. These bolts sit on a little bit of an angle. When we go ahead and we're going to tighten these, we're going to go to 30 newtons. So these new bolts are a 13 head. It's already preset to 30 newtons. There we go. Okay, so the last thing on the rear suspension is going to be to add the spring spacers. So if I measure from where our spring's going to sit over, I'm at 1.5 inches. And I noticed that the front spacers are 1 1/4. I think what that's going to be, we'll see once I get that spring out, is I think there's an OEM rubber insulator on top that's going to probably be removed, and I'm assuming I'm going to measure that. It's going to be 1/4 inch, and then this whole thing will go in its place. So what's my plan of attack here? Again, I don't really have directions on this, so from what I can tell, it looks like I should be able to basically just remove this bolt here, and that will allow this entire arm to move. I will have to loosen these here, which these are a cammed bolt, which gives us our alignment. So I went ahead and I marked some paint markers on this side and the back side on both of these bolts, because I'm going to have these come loose so I can try to swing this arm out of the way, pull that spring, push everything back up into place using a jack, and tighten this bolt back up. That's my plan. We're going to see how that goes. I have an 18mm on the front side and a 15 on the back side. And over here, the back side's an 18 and the front side's a 15. I'm just going to get this loose. I like to mark both sides of this because I've had before where I've accidentally knocked the paint off of here, and then I don't have a reference. So hedge my bet a little bit and put paint on both sides. Alright, that's loose. Let's finish taking this out. I'm assuming once I get this over here pulled, this is all going to kind of spring down. So do be careful so you don't get hit in the face. Hopefully I won't do the same. Okay, well, it didn't spring apart like I expected. Got that bolt pulled. I'll put a pry bar in here and see if I can get that apart. Now we're loose. As I hoped, that all just dropped out, so that's nice. Try to keep the spring oriented, and it looks like the bump stop actually sits down in the center. We'll put a measurement on this. I'm going to bet this is that 1/4 inch we talked about earlier. Sure enough, it's right around that 1/4 inch. So I believe this OEM isolator is going to come out. If you leave this in, you're just going to set a little back end high, I think a 1/4 inch, so I want to try to eliminate that so it sits level. So spacer back in, we're going to put our bump stop back in place, sitting down in the center there. Easy as that. What I'm looking for is to see if this spring needs turn to sit in this cup where it used to be. So it looks like it needs a spin. And then we'll want to verify that it's sitting in that boot as well. So we need to get this top boot and the spring to spin. Alright, so that spring is notched in this upper boot. It's got a notch for the upper part of the spring, and then down here you can see where it used to be. There's a notch there as well. So those two indicate that our spring is in the right place. Beautiful. We're going to take this center bolt here that we loosened up, and on the back side take that 15 and give this a spin till those marks line up again. Hammer and get this cam bolt to seat down between the notches. And right there, that paint coming off is exactly what I talked about earlier, where I like to mark both sides. So I can go to the back side, check my mark before it gets tightened. We'll make sure we hold this back side from spinning. Here's a little bit better footage of what that spring looks like pulled. So again, this bump stop sits down in the center, and then you get your stock OEM isolator that's going to come off. And then this is your new spacer that's going to go on. And again, this stock isolator is a 1/4 inch thick here, where this is a 1/4 inch thicker than your front spacer that you put on the strut. You'll see that's notched, so you want to have that lined up. Here's a quick look with the back all complete. Here's our subframe spacers, that aluminum shiny. Here's our new puck spacer for the top of the spring, and our shock spacers all installed. Next, I'm going to get our wheel spacers on and get our tires installed. Some things to note when going to a wheel spacer. Number one, this car is what's called hub-centric, which means that the rim is centered by the hub and not lug nuts. It usually gets these tapered studs. And we actually went to a shorter stud for these spacers. So we're going to convert over to these. Another thing to note is to use Loctite on these and torque spec these. These are going to be 83 foot-pounds on these, and we use a star pattern. We're going to start here and work our way around to snug them down, and then we're going to go ahead and do our finish tightening with the torque wrench. I got the rear tire installed, and we did have a little bit of rubbing on the front of the rear wheel well. So I cut the other side, basically here, down, and here, and then trimmed this back about 3/4 of an inch. I'll take you to the other side and show you exactly what that looks like. As you can see, this is cut out. This actually kind of tapers in, so that's why it was rubbing the wheel back here. And then just trim this straight down, trimmed this straight down, and then tapered back this way and cut back. Here's a look at our rear wheel well clearance at full droop. So this is at full droop. You can see we have room. It's definitely close, but probably 3/8 of an inch. Pretty much the same thing, maybe slightly more on the driver's side. Here we are on the ground, on the vehicle's weight. Let's take a look at this wheel from the side profile. Real nice side profile. Sticking out of the body, just a fuzz, which I really like. Now it's time to start trimming on the front. This took a lot more cutting than the rear because the wheel turns, obviously, so I would honestly suggest a little bit smaller tire if you're doing this 1 1/4 inch lift. Typical mark, trim, put a tire on, trim a little more, trim a little more. Probably tire's been off 4 or 5 times. It looks as though our backside is going to be good. Go ahead and turn this. Yeah, clearance, that's full right. Front side's going to need a little bit more trimming. Touches there, and then continues through and touches here. All right, after our second cut, it looks like we are clearancing. So here's the look of the car with the lift on and the new bigger tires. But let's get some measurements here as to what this ended up with for our heights. So on our rear wheel well to the ground, we are just a fuzz under 31 inches. The front wheel well to the ground, pretty much exactly right at 31. Our front bumper clearance is all the way up at about 12.25 inches now. The front of the rocker is right around 10.5 inches, and the rear rocker being right around 11.5. Fresh tires. Which looks good.